Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 is a federal law that states that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. This law protects people from discrimination based on sex in education programs or activities which receive federal financial assistance. Women today are provided with more educational and athletic resources than ever before. Prior to Title IX's passage, women were discriminated against and denied many educational and athletic rights. Most people think that Title IX only applies to sports, but athletics is only one of the 10 key areas addressed by the law. These areas include access to higher education, career education, education for pregnant and parenting students, employment, learning environment, math and science, sexual harassment, standardized testing, and technology. Leading up to 1920, organizations such as Alice Paul's National Women's Party and Carrie Chapman Catt's National American Women's Suffrage Association worked to pass the 19th Amendment, which was then passed in 1920 under President Woodrow Wilson, granting women the right to vote. During World War II, many women joined the workforce to replace men who had gone off to war. This created the iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, supporting the idea that women could work in industry alongside men. The women's rights movement did not really pick up speed again until it was reignited by the civil rights movements of the 1960s. With a more active youth and counterculture, the 60s became a platform for African American rights, social justice, and the feminine movement, and encouraged equal opportunities in employment and education for all American citizens. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, was written in 1963. It described the American housewife and criticized the limited role of women in American society. Friedan claimed that the problem that has no name burst like a boil through the image of the happy American housewife. In 1968, a large group of feminists protested the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City. Protesters stood outside with signs yelling, "No more Miss America." They wanted to end the pageant because it promoted judgment of women by unrealistic standards of beauty, declaring it a cattle auction in which men could judge women on their looks to decide their value, similar to the way farmers purchased cows. Student life differed greatly for male and female students. Schools and universities created segregated entrances, one for the girls and one for the boys, to separate the two. Girls were only allowed to take certain courses and were restricted from courses such as auto mechanics and criminal justice, and many universities limited the number of women admitted into their medical and law programs to 15 girls or fewer. In order to keep a minimal number of women, many universities required women to have higher test scores and better grades than male applicants. Female faculty members were excluded from faculty clubs and told to join the faculty wives clubs instead. Women's sports were rare, and female athletes weren't often acknowledged. After Donna De Verona won 2 gold medals for swimming at the 1964 Olympics, she still could not get a college swimming scholarship. There were no allotted money for female college athletes, and scholarships for women athletes made up barely 2% of all college sports scholarships. Although women's suffrage had been granted with the passage of the 19th Amendment, it would not be until 1957 that the number of women's votes for the presidential candidate would be approximately equal to the number of men's. Activism and the fight for equality developed again as more people joined the defense industries to replace those who had gone to fight in the Second World War. During World War II, FDR issued Executive Order 8802, which banned discrimination against minorities in defense industries. This did not protect the many women who had joined the industry to support wartime need. In the 1954 case, Brown v. Board of Education, the court declared segregation in state schools to be unconstitutional. This overturned the 1896 case, Plessy v. Ferguson. The civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s used nonviolent protest and civil disobedience to fight for equality. Prominent groups included the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which organized sit-ins and freedom rides to peacefully protest for the cause. During the 1963 Freedom Summer, led by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Congress of Racial Equality. Both black and white students from across the country helped blacks in more severely racist areas to register for the vote and get involved in political parties. In 1963, the Equal Pay Act established equal payment for men and women doing the same jobs. It states, "No employer having employees subjected to any provisions of this section shall discriminate, within any establishment in which such employees are employed, between employees on the basis of sex, by paying wages to employees in such establishment at a rate less than the rate at which he pays wages to employees of the opposite sex, in such establishment for equal work on jobs, the performance of which requires equal skill, effort, and responsibility, and which are performed under similar working conditions." The provisions of the Civil Rights Act forbade discrimination on the basis of sex, as well as race, in hiring, promoting, and firing. However, this act did not cover domestic and agricultural workers, administrators, or professionals. In 1964, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, or EEOC, was established to protect the Equal Pay Act. The Equal Employment Opportunities Commission investigated complaints and enforced penalties around the workplace. During the first 5 years, the EEOC received about 50,000 complaints of injustice. Although this act was meant to improve working conditions, many women still dealt with inequality in the workplace. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, passed in 1964, was meant to provide some protection from discrimination, but this was rarely carried out. As women entered the workforce during the 50s and 60s, they became more and more dissatisfied with the working and employment conditions. In 1966, Betty Friedan formed the National Organization for Women, which promoted the prosecution of job discrimination cases against women. Friedan believed that the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission was not taking enough action against employment and payment injustice, and so they organized themselves to more aggressively promote an equal treatment for women in all areas of employment, from domestic to industrial. In 1970, the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced to Congress. This act proposed an amendment that declared equality, specifically for women. It was passed by Congress, but was never ratified by the states. The first hearings about sexual discrimination were brought to Congress in 1970, led by two Democratic representatives, Patsy Mink of Hawaii and Edith Green of Oregon. This idea of Title IX was sponsored by Senator Birch Bayh and introduced to Congress. On June 23, 1972, Congress enacted Title IX, and it was signed by President Nixon. It stated that the law protects all citizens from discrimination based on sex in education programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. It also protects students from discrimination based on parental or marital status, allowing more people to receive an education. The passage of the bill received very little attention until one event brought the issue of women's sports and feminism to the national stage. Billie Jean King, who couldn't get a tennis scholarship when she was a student at Cal State Los Angeles, campaigned for higher pay and professional treatment for women tennis players. She was opposed by sports media and even some women tennis players, but nevertheless she pushed on and organized successful professional leagues for women. However, she is most famous for defeating former Wimbledon champion and tennis hustler Bobby Riggs in the Battle of the Sexes. This 1973 match captivated and changed the way women looked at themselves. "I just had to play," King said in a later interview with Newsweek. Title IX had just passed, and I wanted to change the hearts and minds of people to match the legislation. Women's basketball became one of the biggest beneficiaries in post-Title IX opportunities. Cheryl Miller led the University of Southern California women's basketball team to two NCAA titles in 1983 and 1984, and then spurred the United States women's team of basketball gold in the 1984 Olympics. In 1971, fewer than 295,000 girls participated in high school varsity athletics. They accounted for just 7% of all varsity athletes. In 2001, that number leaped to 2.8 million, or 41.5% of all varsity athletes, according to the National Coalition for Women and Girls in Education. In 1973, 43% of female high school graduates were enrolled in college. This grew to 63% in 1994 as a result of Title IX. In 1972, women received 9% of medical degrees, but by 1994, that number had moved up to 38%. 1% of dental degrees grew to 38% in 1994, and the percentage of law degrees earned by women had moved from 7% in 1971 to 43% in 1994. From 1980 to 1990, dropout rates for pregnant students declined 30%, increasing the chances for mothers to be able to support and care for their children as a result of the bill. Currently, 48% of the athletic scholarships are given to women. They get about 40% of the athletes' money, even though they make up roughly 53% of the students in college. Today, more than 3 million girls play sports at their high schools. This is about 41% of girls. Also, the numbers of women's college sports teams have doubled in the past 20 years. Title IX has made great leaps and strides towards women's equality and will continue its upward path. Although you may not be aware of every detail of Title IX, it impacts you every day. Having both a men and women's basketball team, Title IX. Having girls' soccer teams, Title IX. If you have a female doctor, Title IX. When a woman becomes president, Title IX. The list could go on, but what can be taken away is that the impact of Title IX greatly extends to every aspect of the world, not just sports. The educational opportunities that are available to women have grown so much in the past 40 years and are still growing. So watch out, men. One day, women will rule the world.